Roman military personal equipment was produced in large numbers to established patterns, and it was used in an established way. These standard patterns and uses were called the res militaris or disciplina. Its regular practice during the Roman Republic and Roman Empire led to military excellence and victory. The general word for army became exercitus. Roman equipment gave them a very distinct advantage over their barbarian enemies. This did not imply that every Roman soldier had better equipment than the richer men among his opponents. According to Edward Lutwake, Roman equipment was not of a better quality than that used by the majority of its adversaries. Initially, they used weapons based on Greek and Etruscan models. On encountering the Celts, they based new varieties on Celtic equipment. To defeat the Carthaginians, they constructed an entire fleet de novo based on the Carthaginian model. Once a weapon was adopted, it became standard. The standard weapons varied somewhat during Rome's long history, but the equipment and its use were never individual. Overview of infantry. Vegetius, 4th century author of De Re Militari, describes the equipment he believed had been used by heavy and light infantry earlier in the empire. The names of some weapons have been changed from the Latin to the Greek forms, and Greek names have been preferred, for unknown reasons. Perhaps because the center of Roman military power had shifted from Rome to Constantinople. Vegetius says in translation, "The infantry was heavy, because they had helmets, coats of mail, greaves, shields, larger swords, which they call broadswords, and some smaller, which they name half-broadswords, 5-weighted darts placed in the shields, which they hurl at the beginning of the assault. Then double throwables, a larger one with an iron point of 9 ounces and a stock of 5 1/2 feet, which was called a pilum, but now is called a spiculum, in the use of which the soldiers were especially practiced, and with skill and courage could penetrate the shields of the infantry and the mail of the cavalry. The other smaller had 5 ounces of iron and a stock of 3 1/2 feet, and was called a vericulum but now is a verutum. The first line, of hastata, and the second, of principes, were composed of such arms. Behind them were the bearers and the light infantry, whom now we say are the supporters and the infantry, shield bearers with darts, swords and armed just as are nearly all soldiers today. There were likewise bowmen with helmet, coat of mail, sword, arrows, and bow. There were slingers who slung small stones in slings or cudgel throwers. There were artillerymen, who shot arrows from the manuballista and the arqueballista. In the late Roman Republic, and the early Roman Empire, most Roman infantry used swords and specialized throwing spears as their main weapons. In the Middle and late Roman Empire, most Roman infantry used thrusting spears as their main weapons. Personal weapons. Pugio. A pugio was a dagger used by Roman soldiers. It was probably a sidearm. Like other items of legionary equipment, the dagger underwent some changes during the 1st century. Generally, it had a large, leaf-shaped blade 18 to 28 centimeters long and 5 centimeters or more in width. A raised midrib around the length of each side, either simply standing out from the face or defined by grooves on either side. It was changed by making the blade a little thinner, about 3 mm, and the handle was also made out of metal. The tang was wide and flat initially, and the grip was riveted through it, as well as through the shoulders of the blade. Around 50 AD, a rod tang was introduced, and the hilt was no longer riveted through the shoulders of the blade. This in itself caused no great change to the pugio's appearance, but some of these later blades were narrower, and, or had little or no wasting, and, or had reduced or vestigial midribs. Throughout the period, the outline of the hilt remained approximately the same. It was made with 2 layers of horn, wood or bone sandwiching the tang, each overlaid with a thin metal plate. Often the hilt was decorated with inlaid silver. Note that the hilt is 10 to 12 centimeters long overall and that the grip is quite narrow, which may make it seem to be too small, but in fact this produces a very secure grip. An expansion or lump in the middle of the handle makes the user's grip even more secure. Gladius. Gladius is the general Latin word for sword. In the Roman Republic, the term gladius hispaniense referred specifically to the short sword, 50 cm to 60 cm long, used by Roman legionaries from the 3rd century BC. Several different better-known designs followed, among collectors and historical reenactors. The two primary kinds of swords are known as the Mainz gladius, and the Pompei gladius, which follows the Mainz type, which had itself followed the hispaniense. More recent archaeological finds have confirmed the appearance of the earlier version, the gladius hispaniensis. The legionaries wear the gladius on the right hip. Spatha. A spatha could be any sword, but most often one of the longer swords characteristic of the Middle and Late Roman Empire. In the 1st century, Roman cavalry started using these longer swords, and in the late 2nd or early 3rd century, Roman infantry also switched to longer swords, as well as mostly changing from carrying javelins to carrying spears. Shorter weapons were known as semi-spathae or half-swords. A large 3rd century hoard from Kunzing included one triangular-bladed short sword and several narrow-bladed short swords. Bishop and Coulston suggest that some or all were made from broken spathae. Spears and javelins. Asta. Asta is a Latin word meaning a thrusting spear. Hasta were carried by early Roman legionaries. In particular, they were carried by and gave their name to those Roman soldiers known as hastata. However, during Republican times, the hastata were rearmed with pila and gladii, and only the triarii still used asta. A asta was about 6 feet in length. The shaft was generally made from ash, while the head was usually of iron. Javelin. Although Romans often used the word pila to refer to all thrown javelins, the term pilum also means specifically the heavy Roman throwing javelin of the legions. Lighter, shorter javelins existed, such as those used by the velites and the early legions. Pilum. The pilum was a heavy javelin commonly used by the Roman army in ancient times. It was generally somewhat less than 2 meters long overall, consisting of a wooden shaft from which projected an iron shank about 7 millimeters in diameter and 60 centimeters long with a pyramidal head. The iron shank may be socketed or more usually widened to a flat tang. A pilum usually weighed between 2 and 4 kilograms, with the versions produced during the Empire being somewhat lighter. The iron shank would bend upon impact, weighing down the enemy's shield and also preventing the pilum from being immediately reused. The shaft would also fall off on impact, leaving the enemy with a bent shank in their shield. Bow. The Sagittarius was armed with the bow, shooting an arrow with a composite bow, made of horn, wood, and sinew held together with hide glue. However, Vegetius recommends training recruits, arquebus linei, with wooden bows. The reinforcing laths for the composite bows are found throughout the empire, even in the western provinces where wooden bows were traditional. Dart. Late infantrymen often carried half a dozen lead-weighted throwing darts called plumbata, with an effective range of 30 meters, well beyond that of a javelin. The darts were carried clipped to the back of the shield. Torso armor. Not all troops wore torso armor. Light infantry, especially in the early Republic, wore little or no armor. This was both to allow swifter movement for light troops and also as a matter of cost. Legionary soldiers of the 1st and 2nd centuries used a variety of armor types. Some wore mail shirts, while others wore scale armor or Rica segmentata or laminated strip cuirass. This last type was a complex piece of armor which in certain circumstances provided superior protection to the other types of Roman armor, mail armor and scale armor. The testing of modern replicas has demonstrated that this kind of armor was impenetrable to most direct and missile strikes. It was, however, uncomfortable without padding. Reenactors have confirmed that wearing a padded undergarment known as a subair malus relieves the wearer from bruising both from prolonged wear and from shock produced by weapon blows against the armor. It was also expensive to produce and difficult to maintain. In the 3rd century, the segmentator appears to have been dropped in troops of depicted wearing mail armor or scale, the standard armor of the 2nd century auxilia. The artistic record shows that most late soldiers wore metal armor, despite Vegetius' statement to the contrary. For example, illustrations in the notitia show that the armies fabricae were producing mail armor at the end of the 4th century. Actual examples of both scale armor and quite large sections of mail have been recovered, at Trier and Weiler-la-Tour respectively. Within 4th century contexts, officers generally seem to have worn bronze or iron cuirasses, as in the days of the Principate, together with traditional teruges. Lorica segmentator. The lorica segmentator was a type of body armor primarily used in the early Roman Empire, but the Latin name was first used in the 16th century. The armor itself consisted of broad ferrous strips fastened to internal leather straps. The strips were arranged horizontally on the body, overlapping downwards, and they surrounded the torso in 2 halves, being fastened at the front and back by means of brass hooks, which were joined by leather laces. The upper body and shoulders were protected by additional strips and breast and back plates. The form of the armor allowed it to be stored very compactly, since it was possible to separate it into 4 sections. During the time of its use, it was modified several times, the currently recognized types being the Calcresa, Corbridge, and Newstead types. There is also a little-known 4th type, known only from a statue found at Alba Giulia in Romania, where there appears to have been a hybrid form, the shoulders being protected by scale armor and the torso hoops being fewer in number and deeper. The earliest evidence of the lorica segmentator being worn is around 09 BC, and the armor was evidently quite common in service until the 2nd century AD, judging from the number of finds throughout this period. However, even during the 2nd century AD, the segmentator never replaced the Rica Hammett, thus the Hammett mail was still standard issue for both heavy infantry and auxiliaries alike. Roman soldiers, however, bought their own gear, and therefore a group of men would not present the sort of uniform appearance we are used to today. The last recorded use of this armor seems to have been for the last quarter of the 3rd century AD. There are 2 opinions as to who used this form of armor. One is that only legionaries and praetorians were issued with the lorica segmentator. Auxiliary forces would more commonly wear the lorica hammett, or lorica squamator. The second viewpoint is that both legionaries and auxiliary soldiers used the segmentator armor, and this latter view is supported, to some degree, by archaeological findings. The lorica segmentator offered greater protection than the lorica hammett for about half of the weight, but was also more difficult to produce and repair. The expenses attributed to the segmentator may account for the reversion to ring mail after the 3rd to 4th century. Alternatively, all forms of armor may have fallen into disuse as the need for heavy infantry waned in favor of the speed of mounted troops. Lorica hammett. The lorica hammett is a type of mail armor used during the Roman Republic, continuing throughout the Roman Empire as a standard issue armor for the primary heavy infantry, legionaries and secondary troops. They were mostly manufactured out of iron, though sometimes bronze was used instead. The rings were linked together, alternating closed washer-like rings with riveted rings. This produced a very flexible, reliable and strong armor. Each ring had an inside diameter of between 5 and 7 mm, and an outside diameter of about 7 to 9 mm. The shoulders of the lorica hammett had flaps that were similar to those of the Greek linothorax. They ran from about mid-back to the front of the torso, and were connected by brass or iron hooks which connected to studs riveted through the ends of the flaps. Several thousand rings would have gone into one lorica hammett. The manufacture of mail may have originated with the Celts. Although labor-intensive to manufacture, it is thought that, with good maintenance, they could be continually used for several decades. Its utility was such that the later appearance of the famous Rica segmentator, which afforded greater protection for a third of the weight, never led to the disappearance of the ubiquitous mail. And in fact the army of the late empire reverted to the Rica Hammett once the segmentator had fallen out of fashion. Rica squamator. The Rica squamator was a type of scale armor used during the Roman Republic and at later periods. It was made from small metal scales sewn to a fabric backing. It is typically seen on depictions of standard-bearers, musicians, centurions, cavalry troops, and even auxiliary infantry, but could be worn by regular legionaries as well. A shirt of scale armor was shaped in the same way as a Rica Hammett, mid-thigh length with the shoulder doublings or cape. The individual scales were either iron or bronze, or even alternating metals on the same shirt. They could be tinned as well, one surviving fragment showing bronze scales that were alternately tinned and plain. The metal was generally not very thick, 0.5 mm to 0.8 mm perhaps being a common range, since the scales overlapped in every direction. However, the multiple layers gave good protection. The size ranged from as small as 6 mm wide by 1.2 cm tall up to about 5 cm wide by 8 cm tall, with the most common sizes being roughly 1.25 by 2.5 cm. Many have rounded bottoms, while others are pointed or have flat bottoms with the corners clipped off at an angle. The scales could be flat, or slightly domed, or have a raised midrib or edge. All the scales in a shirt would generally be of the same size. However, scales from different shirts may vary significantly. The scales were wired together in horizontal rows that were then laced or sewn to the backing. Therefore, each scale had from 4 to 12 holes, 2 or more at each side for wiring to the next in the row, 1 or 2 at the top for fastening to the backing, and sometimes 1 or 2 at the bottom to secure the scales to the backing or to each other. It is possible that the shirt could be opened either at the back or down one side so that it was easier to put on, the opening being closed by ties. Much has been written about scale armor's supposed vulnerability to an upward thrust, but this is probably greatly exaggerated. No examples of an entire Rica squamator have been found, but there have been several archaeological finds of fragments of such shirts, and individual scales are quite common finds, even in non-military contexts. Limb armor. Manica. From early imperial times to after the fall of the Western Empire, some troops wore segmented armor on one or both arms. Greaves, sheet metal protecting the legs, were widely used in the late Republic, and by some troops in the imperial army. Shields. Scutum. Parma. The Parma was a circular shield, 3 Roman feet across. It was smaller than most shields, but was strongly made and regarded as effective protection. This may have been due to the use of iron in its frame. It had a handle and a shield boss. The Parma was used in the Roman army of the mid-Republic by the lowest class division of the army, the velites. The velites' equipment consisted of a Parma, javelin, sword and helmet. Later, the Parma was replaced by the Scutum, cetra, a light shield of wood and leather, the name from Greek, used by tribesmen from Hispania, Mauritania, and Britannia. Helmets. Roman helmets, Gallia or Cassis, varied greatly in form. One of the earliest types was the Montefortino helmet used by the Republic armies up to the 1st century BC. This was replaced directly by the cullis helmet, which raised the neck peak to eye level and set a sturdy frontal peak to the brow of the helmet. Clothing. Tunic. Basic garment worn under the armor by all soldiers in the Republic and early Empire. normally made of wool. Tunics originally consisted simply of a piece of rectangular cloth sewed to an identical piece, with holes for the arms and head left unsewn. Later, it became fashionable for tunics to be produced with sleeves, and worn with braccae. Focal scarf worn by Roman legionaries to protect the neck from chafing caused by constant contact with the soldier's armor and helmet. Balteus sword belt. Singular militaire, a type of decorated belt denoting rank. Braccae, woolen trousers. Subligaria, underpants. Their existence was confirmed by one of the Vendelanda tablets. Cloak. Two types of cloaks were used, the sagum and the pare nulla. Both were made from wool, which insulated and also contained natural oil to repel water. It was fastened with a fibula. The pare nulla was hooded in colder climates. Carriger, military boots worn by Roman legionaries and auxiliaries throughout the history of the Roman Republic and Empire. The boots were made from leather and laced up the center of the foot and onto the top of the ankle. Iron hobnails were hammered into the sole for added strength, similar to the modern cleat. Terruges, skirt of leather or fabric strips that is worn around the waist to protect the upper legs. Terruges could be fitted with small metal studs and plates to provide additional protection.